Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, a podcast where we discuss imaginary things. Fancy that. So today we're just gonna dive into our subject for the day, which happens to be novellas, but we're gonna come at it a little bit sideways. In that we're gonna start in Tucson, where we lay our scene. So, Tony, you live in Tucson, and you recently had the opportunity to attend the Festival of Books. Can you give us an idea of what that is and what you were doing there?
Yes, I can. So, the Tucson Festival of Books is a weekend when the University of Arizona's open mall space in the middle of campus is taken over by all of these tents, a lot of which are devoted to booksellers and authors and small publishing houses and self-publishing setups and all kinds of things. A lot of them have books for sale. You have used booksellers. You have large bookstores. Bookman's used bookstores in Tucson, actually all over Arizona are there. The university has its bookstore there. So that's really awesome. You can browse a lot of books. There are lots and lots of authors who come in. A lot of the buildings on campus are taken over for the weekend to let authors either singly or in panels talk about what they do. There are basically every genre you could think of has had authors represented at the Tucson Festival of Books over the last few years. The Tucson Festival of Books several years ago is actually where I met Kim Stanley Robinson for one of the first times. I forget if it was the first time. And then hung out with him and Elizabeth Bear, which was kind of cool.
Super cool.
But, so, I was there just because I haven't been there for a few years, and it's fun to go and wander around and look at books. So I was wandering around and looking at books, and I was in one of the big book tents, just like picking up new things that had arresting covers, and so I would flip it open, look at the flap inside, and be like, "Huh, what is this book about? Might be cool." And I just remember I had one too many encounters with something that started, and obviously I'm paraphrasing here, but started with the first sentence that was like, "Another depressed college English professor who is a failed writer, blah 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 blah." And it's like a white hetero guy writing about sad white hetero guys in higher education who is a writer but not a failed writer because this guy is a novelist now writing about this failed writer. And I was just like, no, can't do this anymore. Was not interested.
Meta. Yeah. And the like self-masturbatory meta.
Yeah, totally. And this is something that's carried on for a while because we normally talk about science fiction, fantasy, other kinds of speculative fiction on this podcast, but both Kendra and I have read like really widely, and I've read plenty of literary fiction, but I remember before I came to the MFA, I want to say like the year before, I'd been doing my best to read this list of authors, contemporary and past, who I thought I should have read to be the right kind of person who goes to the MFA. But I just got to the point where I wasn't even reading inside covers anymore. I was just flipping to the Library of Congress, like keyword stuff. And if the words professor or university or English or writer or New York or anything like that appeared, I was just like, nope, not reading this book, back on the shelf.
So there's a trend in MFA programs, in the books on the shelves, in regular literary fiction, as well as in what you might call genre fiction, like science fiction. There's a trend to privilege stale narratives, and there's even there are even active movements to promote these stale narratives in science fiction, particularly, and I'm thinking of the Sad Puppies taking over the Hugo Awards, and we'll talk about the Hugos and many, many other awards, pros and cons, in future podcasts, but I think it's a great example, another great example, which points to the difficulty of finding startling, refreshing, culturally relevant and sensitive narratives that we want to read, and that don't fall into these tropes, these perhaps struggling fifth floor walk-up Manhattan tropes. I don't know anything about New York.
Me neither.
Never been there. No interest in going there.
Nope.
I don't know if I'm unusual in that, but I live in flyover country, and I've lived in flyover country my whole life.
Yeah.
And I love it. And so I think there's quite a few people who live in flyover country who love it and don't even see it as flyover country, because why would you fly over something so wonderful?
Mm-hmm.
But like that, technically speaking, this is, Heartland, USA, where I live, and it's you're seeing some books that emerge from here, but it's still pretty rare. But all that's sort of beside the point, but our sideways slippage into talking about the novella. Because when I look at novellas like Binti, for example, by Nnedi Okorafor, or the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe by Kij Johnson, they struck me, they slapped me about the head and forced me to look at science fiction in a new way. And they did something that science fiction hasn't done for me in a long time, which is diversified my interests and gotten me into a new genre. So when we diss on the establishment, we're only dissing a little bit. Like, we still kind of love the establishment a little bit. Like, it's been a stepping stone, perhaps, to new and better narratives that we do unqualifiedly.
Unqualifiedly?
Unqualifiedly?
I don't know.
Love.
Yeah.
Love.
Yeah.
So I discovered Binti, and you discovered the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe, correct?
Correct.
I'm not getting that mixed up. So where did you discover the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe, and what does it do as a novella, both in form and in content, that's different?
I was looking for books similar to Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, and really the whole of his Southern Reach trilogy. And because there are few good book matching services, you don't have things like Pandora where you can say, hey, I want to read a book like Annihilation, help me out. I know there were things like that once upon a time, and unfortunately they don't exist anymore. The best thing I know of in terms of what I can do on my computer by myself is going to some place like Amazon, searching for that book, and then seeing what recommendations there are, what other people have bought, what Amazon itself recommends based on whatever algorithms it uses. And Vellitt Boe happened to be one of those things that popped up as related to Annihilation. And there were...
So kudos, Amazon!
Yeah, right. So I have mixed feelings
You're still
about
evil,
Amazon, but yeah. So that was one of many that popped up in response to Annihilation. We'll talk more about some of those other ones that we read in response to that. But I picked this up without knowing it, or I requested it at the library without knowing it was a novella. And then when it showed up, I was like, oh boy, that sure is a skinny little book. And I got into it. Well, I read the back first, and it actually has, my copy has a fairly substantial paragraph from Pamela Sargent, who we will also be talking about in the future in response to her Venus trilogy. But she quotes Lovecraft up and down in that review. And when I say up and down, I mean that Lovecraft or Lovecraftian happens 3 times within the short little blurb on the back. And I was like, I sort of am aware of Lovecraft, but I've never read Lovecraft. Do I need to know about this in order to get into this book? And the answer was no. And I think that that's something I encountered after Annihilation too. Whenever you read that kind of weird fiction or even weird science fiction, I've seen it in relation to that. I've seen it in relation to... What's the guy's name? The one who did Perdido Street Station and those. Anyway, when you see weird fiction, it tends to always get related back to Lovecraft for good or for ill. Talking, or rather, thinking about what you said about the establishment and thinking about how things parallel the establishment or grow from the establishment. And it's interesting to me that we have, if I can tangent just slightly, it's interesting to me that this idea of weird fiction, which when we think of weird fiction, or when I think of weird fiction, I think of things like Annihilation and Perdido Street Station and the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe, which play with content, but they also play with form a lot of the time. The way that Annihilation is written, the way that Vandermeer is actually putting his words together on the page, creates that sense of weirdness as much as anything that's actually happening within the book, and I love that.
China Mieville.
China Mieville. Thank you. So, that's exactly it. So, the idea that weird fiction can all be traced back to Lovecraft and is part of like a Lovecraftian tradition is kind of, I don't know, something about that doesn't really sit well with me. That like something, a genre, if you can even call it that, we might even call it an affect or an atmosphere that it's that weird is trying to create, can all be, lumped on this history of Lovecraft, just seems to be shortchanging things like Annihilation, or like China Mieville, or even like the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe, which is not only Lovecraftian, but is a direct response to Lovecraft's work.
As in a rebuttal of Lovecraft's work.
Yes.
And that's actually one of the things which I'm glad I didn't go into reading the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe with anything other than your recommendation. I didn't go in with any of the like critical, my critical gear turned on either, because I've never read Lovecraft and I hadn't read any of the critical literature surrounding the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe. So I didn't know that it was really a rebuttal of a Lovecraft story. And so once I read it, then I started to broaden my understanding of the text by looking into the critical stuff going around it. Mm-hmm. And that was enriching and wonderful, but I think this book has legs, or this novella has legs. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it would have needed Lovecraft in order to be a whole piece on its own.
And I think
and that's beautiful.
I think that we are the perfect example of that, because neither of us has read Lovecraft out and out. We're aware of him. We're aware of the cultural phenomenon that is Lovecraft. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that I haven't read Lovecraft as a badge of honor, because
not at all. It's just I've never gone around to it.
Right. I haven't read Lovecraft, and I don't make any apologies for that, and I'm not proud of it. It's just a thing that has not happened. And yet, the fact that both of us liked this novella as much as we did without being familiar with the specific texts that Kij Johnson was responding to, I think speaks to the accessibility of this particular novella and what she was doing with it outside of solely that direct response.
Yeah. And Kij Johnson herself, I don't know much about her. I don't know that a lot of people know much about her. She seems to be an author who lets her work speak for itself, and that I kind of respect, along with everything else. But yeah, I mean, my encounter with this book was in a sense very pure, mm-hmm. because it wasn't clouded by any of the surrounding a fog, I suppose, of critical noise, and it wasn't obscured by the white noise or the background noise of everything that's been going on in science fiction lately in terms of political conversations and all of that. I had no entry point, I had no anchor, and I had no guiding star reading this book, but it created its own architecture as I was reading it and was highly pleasurable. So as far as recommendations go, thank you, Tony. I not only have read this book and enjoyed it myself, but managed to purchase a copy for our library collection.
Nice.
I have successfully loaned my copy and retrieved my copy, which is a blessing, from 2 coworkers who loved it. And I have another person that I'm planning on loaning it to next week. So it is a book that travels very well.
Yeah, it is. It's small. I mean, if nothing else, we can just point to the fact that novellas are skinny little books, and so you can give them easily to other people, and they can give them easily back. It's not like giving, a brick of a 700-page hardcover epic to someone.
It's true. It's not like handing off Kim Stanley Robinson's 2410, which I will eventually be getting into. I bought it, and then I keep looking at it and going, I'm not ready.
My body isn't ready for this book.
No, I mean, because, so I picked up that and his what's the trilogy of books he wrote about
The Three
Climate?
Californias?
I don't know if it's the Three Californias. It's just like a trilogy.
The 40-something something, the 50-something something, and the 60-something something.
I think that's it. Yeah. So cool. I got that because it was on the shelves at the book exchange. Yeah. And so like it was a kind of a providential thing, and so I picked it up while it was there and I could get it. So that is a massive tome. And then I picked up 2410 at Barnes & Noble because none of my indie bookstores had it. Mm-hmm. Cough, cough. And so I was carrying both of those books home, and I was like, what is wrong with me? And that, I think, is partially the result of having read so many excellent novellas lately, where I'm like, yes, this is portable. I can stick this in my pocket, mm-hmm. not just in my bag. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, this can travel with me to work, to the dentist. I got a filling lately. Distractions are great.
Yes.
So I'm an advocate for novellas and the short form, as long as the stories being told feel complete and that they have legs.
Yes. And that is where I didn't actually answer the question you asked me several minutes ago, so let me actually answer that.
Do it.
And I want to actually compare Vellitt Boe to another book I picked up at the same time, again, that was recommended because of my interest in Annihilation, that I frankly don't know where Amazon got that recommendation from. Maybe other readers, maybe folks who are like our listeners who may have also read this suite of books, so that would be awesome. Anyway. The algorithm. That book was Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time.
Which, oh God, the giant sentient spider bite.
Yes, which is much more a traditional kind of space opera epic in that it spans time, it spans species. It's fairly, I don't want to say really, it's fairly long. It's definitely several hundred pages. It pays a lot of attention to character arcs and character development, species development, even more so than certain characters. And it has some veins of weird running throughout. Definitely, I feel like you can't get behind protagonists who are giant spiders without having some weird stuff happening, as long, if you're trying to represent them well. But I mentioned this book because I read both of them around the same time, and while I like Children of Time a whole lot, and we'll talk about it in subsequent podcasts,
on its own.
What it didn't really do that Vellitt Boe did is really consider the sentence, the phrase, and the word level effect the words were having. I don't mean to say that it was careless or poorly written in any way. Its focus was just not primarily on that sentence, phrase, and word level stuff, because it was a longer work and there was a lot going on there. Whereas, like I said about weird fiction or weirdly affected books in general, Vellitt Boe felt so precise in the word order, the word placement, the word choice, the diction, the syntax. Everything was here to serve the story that Case Johnson was telling in these pages and no more. This is not a book that is going to have sequels. It's not a book where we're going to see these characters again. I mean, I would like to. I'd like to return to this world and know more about these characters, but that wasn't the point of this book. This wasn't a sequel hook. This wasn't a saga in the making or a series. This was exactly what it needed to be, and I appreciated that. And that's something that I honestly, I don't know that I encounter it much anymore.
No, I think I agree, and I think it perhaps would be unsupportable in a book that was the length of something like Children of Time, which has its own strengths, but
yes, and I don't know. I don't want to hate on Children of Time. That I also want to put that out there. I really liked Children of Time, and I mention it only as like a length.
Sure. And I also would like to clarify that, like, I don't think that it's impossible to write a book the length of Children of Time with the precision in all ways that Vellitt Boe has.
I agree.
What I'm saying is impossible. Really, it's more just improbable that an author in today's world would take the lifetime it would require to generate that text. There's a push now for authors to write and publish, and something that novellas allow you to do is write, publish, and see your book in the world within the course of a single year, which you don't get with novels like Children of Time at all. Yeah. That's a 2-year process minimum from start to finish.
Bare minimum.
And so So, like, authors like Nnedi Okorafor, who we've talked about before on this podcast, she's writing the third book. Well, actually, she's finished writing the third book in the Binti trilogy, and we'll talk about Binti in a couple minutes. But she finished it, like, maybe a couple weeks or a month ago, depending on when you listen to this podcast. And the book is going to be released in September. That's fast.
Yeah.
Like, it's finished in the first quarter or third of the year, and it's published in the third quarter of the year.
Yeah.
Like, that's really impressive. That's like 6 to 8 months start to finish. And like that allows you to see your book and respond to your present needs and still benefit from publishing in a way that we wouldn't have seen if the novella hadn't seen this resurgence that it has in the last decade.
Yeah.
And like I think there's value in that. I think that it changes the way we write and what we read, because the market, you know, has its own demands and its own shaping effects on what we do. And so, like, I don't know that I would want to read a book that was the length of Children of Time that was written like Vellitt Boe, but I also, like, I just think that there's such... She's streamlined the story as well, so I don't know that the story itself could support that weight. Like, she would have to flesh out the world way too much, and it would be distracting. Like, I just want the character Vellitt Boe. Like, that's literally all I want. And her world is enough. It's sufficient. And I've read a lot of criticism, and I mean criticism in the literary sense, about novellas which speak to, like, them being this vehicle for the unfinished narrative, the, like, really satisfying unfinished narrative, like the aesthetic of well, maybe the aesthetic is the point. And I can see, I've also recently read Agents of Dreamland by Caitlin Kiernan, and I can see that being a good example of what they're saying in terms of your feeling, your emotion emerging from the text is more important than the completion of the plot. And I'm a little bit at war with myself over that, I have to admit. I wanted something more from Agents of Dreamland, but I didn't want something more from the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe. And so there are novellas, and then there are novellas, and then there are novellas.
Yeah, right. And it's hard to say that, and obviously I can't speak for what the criticism that you've read is saying, because now that's, like, triple filtered. But with that said, like, I think it would be a mistake to box novellas and say the point of novellas is to, appreciate the aesthetic of the unfinished narrative, because that's basically saying that novellas as an art form, as a written art form, are by definition unfinished because they're short, which seems like bullshit to me. And I seriously doubt that, like, that is the claim, that, I can't represent the claim as being that simple, because I don't even know what the claim is. But the fact that novellas are a shorter form, is part of, I don't know. It's like, it's thinking about, a really well-crafted short story versus a really well-crafted novel. Like, you can't really compare them and say that one form is therefore superior over the other because of some good or some bad works you've read of that length. It just doesn't make sense. But then, I'm sort of like, I'm saying this and it seems self-evident as I'm saying it, but I'm also sort of struggling with, like, I didn't pick up novellas until, like, a few months ago. Like, I just didn't even consider them. Like, if it was something that was that short, I was like, well, I'll read that in a couple of days. Why would I pick that up? Like, I honestly had that thought process. This is too short.
And why would I buy it, For our listeners who aren't as familiar with novellas as a codified genre, I don't know if you call it a genre, as a codified category of publishing words, you have a hierarchy now that's pretty well nailed down. So it starts at the top with novels, which is the longest work that you're going to find on the shelf, which is 40,000 and more words. And that's a decent length, but it's also not massive to say 40,000 words is your bottom line.
Just as a point of comparison, do you know any word counts off the top of your head? I think even, like, the first Harry Potter novel was above 40,000 words.
It was. Like, it would account for most books in the junior fiction category of the public library, and a lot of those books are fairly thin. So a thin book can still be counted as a novel by this categorization. Down below the novel, you have novellas, and those range from 17,000-ish to 40,000-ish words. And I say ish because I believe Tor.com considers its novella review process to be open only to works above 20,000. So there's a little bit of flexibility there. But, you're looking at something from a thin book to a super thin book. And like, there's a fair number of those that I've read, both nonfiction and fiction, growing up, that I wouldn't have considered novellas simply because nobody presented them to me as such. So I think there's quite a lot that can fall within that word range that we haven't necessarily called out as novellas in the past, but now could theoretically fall in that definition.
Yeah.
And below novellas, you have novelettes. And novelettes are from roughly 7,500 to 17 or 20,000 words. So again, like, halve the length of a novella and you have a novelette. And halve the length of a novelette and you've got a short story. So like 3,500 to 7,500. Like, this is pretty technical. Like, a lot of publishing houses have agreed on this. And a lot of journals, literary journals, use these word length categories to define what you can submit to their flash fiction or their short story or their novella submission process. And flash fiction is like 50 to 1,000 words. So, like, we're talking about these things as if we can apply novella as a term to anything that's a very short book, but that's not strictly true from a publishing perspective. From a publishing perspective, like, these are codified. Like, there's literal word counts associated with the definition. So we have to be a little bit careful, for those of you guys who are kind of just getting into novellas, that we don't confuse you with, substituting our somewhat more generous label for the publishing label. Or like, at least know that they're both out there. And we might have a little bit of a throwdown fight with the codified word counts and everything. So, you know how much we like to spite the institution.
Yes.
So okay, so let's do a little bit of a backtrack. Because we mentioned Binti. And Binti is one of my passions because I discovered it and it's weird and wonderful. And I honestly have been hearing about Binti for a while. The second book is out in the series. So, like, I've heard the word around. The first book won. Did it win Hugo and the Nebula?
I know it won at least one, but I'm not sure about both.
It might have, I think it was a finalist for one and won the other, or something along those lines. And so it's gotten some talk in the award circuit, which is a great way to discover new novellas at this point, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But Binti is the story of this girl who is from the Himba people, and this is a tribal people living in North Africa, and they are not space goers, but Binti becomes the first of her people to go to space, and she's going to this space university called Umba or something along those lines. Umza University. And while she's en route, the ship she's on gets attacked or hijacked, something along those lines, by a jellyfish-like alien people who is at war with a separate human ethnic group, which she is not a part of, and they're called the Kush. And so far it kind of sounds like, okay, I don't quite get what's going on here. And and the language of the book is rich in what I would call word gems, or like word finds, words that the author, Nettie Okorafor, has imported from her own culture, and words that she has hybridized or made up that just feel like a part of the world and fit very nicely. And so, like, there's a certain amount of discombobulation that happens in the first couple chapters of Binti because it moves really fast. And there's no downtime in this book. So the ship is attacked. The Kusha aren't really, they're not really a people group that she's pals with, but they're also not a people group that she's really at war with. So when the ship gets attacked, she's in this ambiguous. She's in an ambiguous sort of position relative to the attackers, and she ends up surviving, and the plot goes on from there. But all of that happens in the first 2 or 3 chapters.
Mm-hmm. It's very quick.
And there's you go from walking the high plains of Africa to a space massacre.
Yes.
A very bloody space massacre. And it was such a surprise to me that these two things, maybe not hard science fiction, but gripping, gritty science fiction could coexist in the same book as this. She even talks about how the Himba people are kind of considered backwards, or they're not modernizing the same way that the Kush have been. Mm-hmm. And so it was a great mashup of these two different worlds that she still somehow managed to get over and done in 160 pages mm-hmm. or something ridiculous like that. I don't know what your experience was, but I was super impressed with everything that happens in Binti and the way that it concludes. And there is a sequel. You don't have to read the sequel in order to appreciate the first one. Mm-hmm. Have you read Binti Home yet?
No, I have not. Okay. I haven't.
Okay.
But I'd like to, because I did like Binti quite a lot. And what I want to say, what I was thinking of while you were talking right then, is that when I think of a longer book, and by longer I mean anywhere from a couple hundred pages up, and this isn't author specific. I'm looking from everyone from Ian M. Banks to Octavia Butler to Chris Beckett to Douglas Adams even. This is not by any means specific to any one author in science fiction or fantasy, but what books of those lengths really have to do is string you along. And I mean that, it sounds like when I say that, I mean that in a bad way, and I really don't, but I just mean when you have a book of at least a couple of hundred pages, you want to keep a reader reading. You want to keep them mm-hmm. invested for whatever reasons. And when mm-hmm. I think of one of the things that does that, and that it would be really difficult to, keep your reader interested in reading without, that is scenic work within specific scenes that sets up characters in places doing things, paints you a mind picture. Mm-hmm. And I'm coming back around to Binti to say that what I love about Binti and what Nnedi Okorafor does is that she's very visual to me. Her writing is mm-hmm. very visual, and she creates a small number. I want to say 3, maybe 4. I'm thinking of the beginning of the book, then the 2 ships, and then when she gets to the university. Creates essentially these paintings, these very lush canvases of images with her words, and I feel like I'm reading something visual. Mm. And I feel like that's more allowed because this is a novella. It's short. She doesn't have to dazzle me with a museum of images and scenes and things that keep moving and keep me interested in tracking what's going on. And it's also not a short story. It's not a single painting that is something that I want to spend my time with and really pore over every word. It's somewhere in the middle. The word work is there. The sentence level, phrase level work is there. But she's giving me enough for this particular form that I have somewhere for my eyes to range, for me to have fun playing with, at the same time that I don't feel constrained by the amount of time I'm allowed to spend with these characters in these paintings in this world. And I really love that. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, that's equally as true for Vellitt Boe, even though Vellitt Boe is, by definition, it's right there in the title, the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe. We're moving for most of that book, so it's not as singularly visual as Binti was to me. And yet I think a lot of what operates in that way, using that visual metaphor, also is going on in Vellitt Boe.
Yeah, no, and actually I was going to say, you might be tapping into something that you didn't even know you could be tapping into, which is the fact that Nydia Crofer has a deep-seated love and passion for Afrofuturist and otherwise Afrocentric art traditions. There's some phenomenal stuff that she posts to her Twitter feed, that she participates in these like artist collectives and things, and has, I don't know if she's modeled or somehow otherwise contributes to them. And she's posted some of the images that emerge from it, and it's just stunning work. It's also very alien and phenomenally visually evocative. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. I don't have much more information than that I can pull off the top of my head, but she is a visual person, I think. And not to say that the other senses are lacking in Binti.
Not at all.
In fact, I would say the first sense that I would think she would tap into is actually touch, because there's a lot of sensual experience which is explored, not sexual sensual, but the spreading of the clay substance that she and her people are known for mixing.
Yes.
They spread that on their skin and put it in their hair, and this is a recurring storyline of the book in a really pleasing way, and also central to the plot. So,
and I wouldn't necessarily say that it isn't sexual. I think it's doing it a disservice to say that it is sensual, but I feel like it's also doing it a disservice to lose the sexual part of the sensuality of that movement.
It's just sensual, like the straight up every sense is engaged, and I think it's rich, and no matter which way you look at it. Of course, I'm not necessarily as someone who is asexual, I'm not necessarily drawn to texts which are sexual sensual. Right. And sometimes I can be turned off by it. Neither thing happened here. Yeah. It was sensual in a different way for me. And I think in a way it was dramatically different from the kind of sensuality which is explored in Agents of Dreamland and some of these other short texts that we've explored. In some ways, each one is kind of an experiment in a sense, and some of these experiments reach really pleasing conclusions aesthetically and plot-wise. Some reach pleasing conclusions aesthetically but not plot-wise, which is what I would say of Agents of Dreamland for me personally. And some reach satisfying conclusions plot-wise but don't work hard on the aesthetic side of things or the sensual side of things. And I'm reminded of my background as a kid. I grew up reading genre Western fiction because my dad was a big fan. And if you've ever heard the name Louis L'Amour, you'll know what I'm talking about. He has 2 shelves worth. And so these are books which are pulp fiction. And novellas have a long relationship with pulp fiction. In fact, they kind of co-evolved and stole from each other and became each other briefly or for a long time. That's up for debate. But so like pulp fiction is roughly the same length in a lot of ways to novellas. So it could fall under novella, the category publishing wise. And yet there was nothing in Louis L'Amour that engaged you on an aesthetic level. Like, at least me. It didn't engage me on an aesthetic level. I don't want to do disservice to other Western lovers. We read them because of the pleasure of seeing the plot orchestrated and the plot come to the inevitable formulaic conclusion. There was satisfaction in that. So I think of experiments I think of novellas as offering a new avenue specifically for aesthetic experimentation. And in that, we've always had these genre forms, or we have for a long time, like Western, like mystery, that are pretty formulaic. And the pleasure in reading those isn't, for most people, in the aesthetic experiments. It's in the plot. And so novellas give us the opportunity to steal whatever we want from whatever genres we want, mash them up, but focus on aesthetics. So I like to see books like Binti and the Dream-Quest of Vellitt Boe, where both plot and the atmosphere being evoked, the affect, as you said, are brought to completion or to a point of great moment, perhaps. So I don't know how you feel, but we are approaching the end of this podcast. So do you have we missed anything about novellas that you think are crucial?
Well, I have a question for you.
Sure.
I am drawn to novellas now in a way that I wasn't before, just because, in part, I wasn't really aware of them. Like, I saw skinny books and I didn't think I wanted to pick them up, but now I'm more interested in them. I'm wondering if that move is because I was unaware of them and now my eyes have been opened to a whole new library of books that I didn't see before, or because there are more novellas coming out, like both Binti and Vellitt Boe and Agents of Dreamland, I believe, have been published within the last couple of years. So are there more novellas now than there used to be, especially more novellas that are pushing genre writing, speculative fiction, in different directions than before? And is there something we could, take away from talking about these books as far as what boundaries need to be pushed back and what novellas can do that maybe novels can't or aren't doing right now?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's like 50 questions packed into one.
I know. I'm sorry. That was so many questions.
I think I can answer a lot of them in a brief amount of time, and that I can point you to some other resources which have some information on like the history of novellas. And the answer, in short, is it's both and on whether there's more now or you're just noticing more. So we talked about novellas as a category for publishing, and there are a lot of books which haven't always been called novellas, but are being called novellas now, and that's never been in doubt once the term was kind of coined and applied to them. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of books like Hemingway and Wells, H.G. Wells, and Camus, and Jack London, or is it Camus? Like
Camus. Yeah.
Oh, thank God. I've never pronounced that aloud, so thank you.
Yeah.
So a lot of those authors, like, they wrote novellas. Now, they weren't thinking they were writing novellas because they weren't thinking about novels versus novellas at the time, but they are now published as novellas and they've been considered as novellas ever since the term was kind of brought into vogue. And so I've been reading a lot of criticism lately. I think that's probably bled through in a lot of what I've said in this podcast, but a lot of it indicates that there's been a resurgence in the novella as a useful tool for readers and publishers alike. And this movement is about 10 years old. So it probably saw its first big peak in about 2008. And you saw websites coming into being like Tor.com around the time. So you saw a real diversification of publishing options for science fiction writers, period. The internet had finally reached a point of sophistication where it was convenient, easy, useful, and readable to post to places like Tor.com. And Tor.com started publishing novellas in 2015 as physical books, I want to say. Mm-hmm. And so actually, when you look at the Hugo Awards, this was my clue while I was collecting for the library. We were trying to get a hold of the Hugo and Nebula Award nominees for the novella category. And prior to 2015, they pretty much don't exist as physical books that you can collect for a library. After 2015, suddenly Tor.com is publishing a shit ton of novellas. And actually, Agents of Dreamland, Binti, I think even Vellitt Boe were all published by Tor. And so, like, the physical books were, I think. Yeah. I don't have Vellitt Boe in hand, so I can't verify that.
Vellitt Boe was, or at least my copy was.
Yeah, so like you're seeing this really valuable service being provided by one website that decided, we have enough of a market. I think we could publish these as physical books, and I'm eternally grateful to them as a librarian that they did that. So, answer A: novellas have always been out there. Answer B: there's been a resurgence in them as something marketable, as a category. And so then you're probably seeing more novellas being written as a result of the fact that now they're getting more press and people realize they can actually write and publish a piece and see it on the shelf within the span of a year, which is wonderful. Yeah. And you can get more immediate financial returns. Like, you're probably going to even out. Like, if you publish 3 novellas in the course of 3 years, you're probably going to get about the same financial reward as if you publish one book every 3 years. That's longer. But you have a benefit in that you're constantly building your audience. You're not leaving people hanging forever. You're feeding people constantly, so they're not likely to wander off and abandon ship for other series, as often happens with these longer sci-fi books. So there are benefits to the novella, practically speaking, that are like they're snowballing the effect and making them more popular for authors. So authors are probably writing more novellas and publishing more novellas, and they're seeing more critical acclaim. They now have award categories, which is wonderful and weird, and we'll talk about awards again later. And so you're actually seeing some tension now, where you have like the old school people in like Asimov's and some of these other sort of pulp magazines and things like that, who are like, well, back in the day, we didn't need Tor.com. But then you're seeing this whole new, really diverse group of authors publishing novellas through Tor and other publishers now. Like Nettie, I don't know that Nettie would have been a safe author to publish for a big publishing house, but Tor can take more risks. And I mean, we're seeing books like The Fifth Season and N.K. Jemisin, we've podcasted about before, being published traditionally, but there are elements to The Fifth Season that are more traditional and more safe in a sense to publish. Like, it's going to be good. It's a pretty safe bet that it's going to sell some copies. Binti took everyone by surprise that I know of. And so, yeah, I think the novella allows for a little bit more experimentation and a little bit more representation and diversity, even, than is safe, and I'm doing air quotes with my fingers that you can't see, that is safe with traditional publishing houses. So, yeah, I think we talked about there being a lot of, like, Manhattan, boring vanilla narratives out there in literature. I think people recognize a good thing when they see it, and they just happen to see it in the novella. And so right now it's a little bit in vogue. I think it will bleed out into other genres again, and it'll reach some sort of equilibrium. But right now there is a disproportionate amount of really cool, experimental, diverse authors publishing novellas. So that is kind of my long-winded answer to your question. And I realize I probably only answered one of the 50 questions, but hopefully I kind of gave a slice of information.
I think so.
That relates to the others. So
yeah.
Do you have any final comments to close us out today, Tony?
Only that I will be picking up more novellas in the future.
More novellas.
You can find us on SoundCloud and on iTunes. Remember that we are the Imaginaries. You can also find all of our episodes, because SoundCloud and iTunes only host the past 5 or so, on YouTube. Again, search for the Imaginaries podcast. You can find us, links to all of those places on our website at www.imaginaries.us, and you can follow us on Twitter at imaginary_pod to find out what we're talking about, what other people are talking about, when we release new things, what you like. You can tweet at us, you can retweet us, we can retweet you. I don't really know how Twitter works, so I hope I used all those things correctly. I think I did, but you know more about it than I do. Bye.